Welcome to the debate. Our source material today is Simple But Not Easy, Munger's final lesson. It frames the whole pursuit of long-term success, whether it's in finance, health, whatever, around this really jarring paradox. The rules for success are deceptively simple. Spend less than you make, compound knowledge, tell the truth, avoid stupidity. And yet, Munger's final lesson is that these simple acts are just immensely difficult to execute consistently.
Right. And that recognition that the difficulty is internal, not external, that's what really elevates this material beyond, your standard self-help. It forces us to confront why we consistently fail at the very things we rationally know are good for us.
Absolutely. And that internal failure is precisely where our debate lies. So, our central question for today is this: is the fundamental challenge in achieving long-term success primarily psychological? The internal struggle against ego, emotions, and the tribe, the things that make simple acts feel uncomfortable. Or is the challenge fundamentally procedural and cognitive, the sustained effort required to actually master and integrate the complex intellectual toolkit that Munger developed? I'll be arguing that the core barrier is that psychological resistance, the self-sabotage driven by what the text calls the three bodyguards.
And I'm going to argue that while those psychological barriers are, of course, immensely powerful, they are often symptoms, not the root cause. The primary difficulty, I believe, is the sustained cognitive complexity and procedural rigor required to properly implement the full Munger toolkit over decades. The very notion that the solutions are simple, well, it confuses conceptual clarity with operational complexity.
I appreciate that distinction, but I have to say, the source material seems very clear about the hierarchy of problems here. The text defines the core conflict explicitly. It says, the final boss isn't a monster. The final boss looks simple. The difficulty is in overcoming the resistance to acts that, by their nature, feel uncool, uncomfortable, or lonely. The answers for long-term success are simple, but the resistance is always generated by the same three internal forces, those psychological bodyguards. First, you have ego. It just hates discipline and insists that we're special, so we're somehow exempt from the simple rules. Second, emotions. They hate waiting. They demand immediate gratification. And that, manifests as anxiety or the need to just constantly scroll. And third, peer pressure, the tribe, which enforces conformity. It makes even simple, rational acts, like bringing a modest lunch to work, feel like a profound social failure. The text offers Munger's cheat code, right? It confirms that when you defeat those three psychological bodyguards, everything else becomes easy. And that's the key piece of evidence for me. If defeating the psychological resistance makes everything else easy, then the psychological resistance has to be the primary constraint. Look at the difficulty of achieving that first benchmark. The first $100,000 is the hardest, and it's a bench. That pain isn't due to a complex calculus. It's the sheer emotional endurance required to resist envy, to endure boredom, and just maintain discipline while everyone else is out there spending.
Okay, I see why you emphasize that emotional dimension. I really do. But focusing solely on the pain of resistance, it feels like it overlooks the rigorous intellectual framework that Munger insists upon. To say the solutions are truly simple conflates a powerful slogan with an operating manual. The real challenge is the sustained application and integration of the intellectual system, what he calls the lattice work of mental models. Munger's success stems from deploying a comprehensive intellectual toolkit: inversion, Lollapalooza, margin of safety, second-order thinking, opportunity cost. Successfully integrating these concepts requires constant intellectual rigor, foresight, and pattern recognition across multiple domains. That is a monumental cognitive demand, not just, managing an impulse buy. Consider the material's own example of Alex. He moves from impulsivity to investing in an index fund and applying Anki flashcards daily.
The Anki example is very telling. Anki is a spaced repetition system. It's a complex procedural habit designed to compound knowledge efficiently. Alex's success wasn't just an emotional win over his ego. It was the successful implementation of a complex, structured cognitive system. The true challenge is maintaining the discipline of that structural application, which is a test of intellectual endurance. The difficulty lies in when and how to deploy the right mental model in a chaotic, real-world environment. That cognitive decision-making is the structural backbone of Munger's success.
But that structural backbone only stands if the psychological forces don't kick out the foundation. Let's talk about that structural conflict in detail, starting with the locus of difficulty, simple rules versus complex models. You emphasize the complexity of the models, but the simple things that actually yield, big money or long-term happiness are universally behavioral. Patience in the waiting, spend less than you make, always be saving something. These are simple actions made difficult solely by the brain's internal architecture: ego, emotions, tribe. The intellectual answers are known. The willingness to endure the boring, uncool execution is the problem.
That's a powerful articulation of the behavioral challenge. But I'd argue that Munger's work elevates these simple concepts into complex cognitive tasks. Take spend less than you make. For the average person, okay, this is an accounting task. For the successful Mungerite, applying that mandate means applying margin of safety, which doesn't just mean buying cheap. It means constantly calculating your room for error in finance and in life. It's a cognitive buffer against inevitable risks that requires foresight. Or consider Lollapalooza. This is the synthesis of multiple psychological forces hitting you at once, like confirmation bias and social proof, magnifying a market mania. Recognizing that confluence and knowing when those forces combine to create an extreme outcome. That's a high-level cognitive task demanding calculation and intellectual awareness, not just self-control.
I think you're confusing the tools with the motor. The models are indeed power-ups, but the ego is the person who refuses to even lift the controller. The text explicitly says the bodyguards team up to make sure you never, ever pick the simple path. The brain hates simple, yes, but why? It hates simple because simple is boring. It hates deliberate practice like those 20 minutes of Anki daily you mentioned because it provides no immediate dopamine reward, making it a target for the emotional bodyguard. The procedural failure of consistency is a result of the ego convincing you that discipline is unnecessary and the emotions preferring instant, exciting distraction. The psychological resistance is the ultimate veto power over the cognitive toolkit.
But the material itself suggests that the toolkit is the leverage point. If you fail to procedurize the toolkit, you fall victim to your psychology. Munger's entire genius was developing these models precisely because he recognized that human psychology is inherently flawed. The solution isn't just wishing away your ego. The solution is building a system, a cognitive shield, that forces rationality. The cognitive labor of building that latticework, of connecting ideas from physics, economics, and history, that is a monumental intellectual task that precedes effective emotional management. If you don't do the cognitive work, the emotional struggle becomes, well, basically impossible to win.
Let's pivot then, because the emotional struggle is nowhere more pronounced than when dealing with the tribe. The text identifies peer pressure as one of the 3 definitive bodyguards, making adherence to those simple rules feel like social death. The example of Alex is key here. His victory was walking into the cafeteria with his brown bag lunch, choosing quiet, long-term compounding over spending $12 on fast food just to avoid the smoke from the loud, impulsive crowd. Going against the tribe feels like death. It triggers the oldest, deepest psychological fears of exclusion, even when the tribe is demonstrably engaged in self-destructive behavior. This, to me, strongly suggests that social and emotional calculus overrides even the best rational cognitive framework. Alex's win was asking, whose movie am I in? That is a purely psychological victory over external validation, not a triumph of complex calculus.
I'm not convinced that the tribe challenge is purely emotional. I believe it's often a byproduct of a failure to apply a key cognitive model. Inversion. The material advises, how would I be 100% guaranteed to fail at this? Inversion is a rational forecasting model. If Alex had truly internalized and proceduralized that model, he would recognize the tribe's behavior, blowing money, seeking instant gratification, poor planning, as the direct path to guaranteed failure. That rational understanding that the tribe is literally running toward a cliff should precede and significantly mitigate the emotional pain of being uncool.
The core failure is the cognitive lapse, failing to run the inverse scenario, which would logically dismiss the tribe's demands before the emotional pain of exclusion even registers.
But that requires perfect, instant rationality, which is exactly what the psychological bodyguards are engineered to prevent. When your ego is whispering that you need to be popular right now, and your emotions are demanding instant relief from social anxiety, the cognitive step of inversion, that deliberate, difficult act of running a mental simulation, is simply overwritten by the noise. The psychological bodyguards are the gatekeepers that prevent the intellectual tools from ever being deployed.
But if the psychological challenge is the final boss, why did Munger spend a lifetime refining intellectual models rather than, say, perfecting Stoic meditation techniques? He refined tools for thinking because he recognized that superior thinking leads to superior behavior. The bodyguards are manifestations of human entropy, but the toolkit is the procedural system built specifically to resist that entropy.
He refined the tools so people could think, but he constantly warned that the failure was behavioral. And that behavioral imperative brings us to our final point, defining mastering. The text concludes that you don't have to use 100% of the toolkit to win. Just avoiding the big dumb mistakes and using a few models turns you into a superhero. This is used to indicate that stopping the self-sabotage, which is driven by the bodyguards, is the main mechanism for success. The ultimate behavioral mandate is avoid crazy at all costs.
I fully agree that avoiding crazy is the path to success, but I would strongly disagree that avoiding crazy is merely a choice or a simple behavioral command. Avoiding big dumb mistakes is the core cognitive discipline. It requires constant second-order thinking, which is the model that asks, and then what, before you post, buy, or make a critical decision. This isn't about simply choosing not to be crazy. It's about deliberately forcing a pause, running a complex mental forecast of long-term consequences, and analyzing the impact 3 steps down the line. This procedural step is specifically designed to circumvent the initial emotional or ego-driven impulse. The struggle against crazy is procedural inertia, the immense difficulty of making the complicated process of critical, second-order thinking automatic and reflexive, rather than merely suppressing a feeling. If you fail to proceduralize that deep level of thought, the impulse wins every time.
I find that compelling, I do, but it still rests on this idea that the impulse can be tamed by a thought process. The material states that the answers never change, but the difficulty is always those 3 bosses. This suggests a fixed struggle against immutable human nature. The cognitive models are fantastic navigational maps. But if your internal crew, ego and emotions, is constantly mutinying and throwing the map overboard, the intellectual effort is wasted. The primary discipline remains internal, emotional and psychological management, which allows the simple rules to operate unimpeded. The simple rules work. The difficulty is submitting to them when they feel basic or slow.
And yet, the very framework for achieving that consistency, the compounding of knowledge, the systematic lattice work, the use of structured learning like Anki, is an intellectual commitment. If you look at Munger's greatest insights, they are intellectual mandates. Just stay rational longer than everyone else. Rationality requires continuous cognitive maintenance and deployment of tools, which is far from simple. The cognitive architecture defines the stability of the long-term journey.
We both certainly agree that Munger demands rigor on all fronts. The lesson is, indeed, not easy.
Agreed.
So, to summarize my position, the source material is fundamentally clear that the conceptual knowledge for success is available and it's simple. The consistent point of failure, the final boss, is that internal warfare waged by ego, emotions, and the tribe against boring, consistent action. The highest form of discipline required is the psychological fortitude to simply wait and to resist external validation. The cognitive models are necessary to chart the course, but conquering the bodyguards is necessary to stay on it.
And I'll summarize by affirming that while the psychological hurdles provide the immediate pain and friction, they are often symptoms of an insufficient cognitive commitment. The difficulty is the continuous intellectual work required to deploy a diverse toolkit, like the lattice work, inversion, and Lollapalooza, and maintain complex procedural habits against psychological entropy. The operational difficulty of consistent rationality is the true structural challenge, and that requires an intellectual mastery far beyond just emotional control.
Both of our perspectives really do illuminate the complex nature of Munger's final lesson, showing that achieving success demands engagement with both the deepest parts of human psychology and the sustained intellectual application of robust models.
Indeed. Understanding this material requires exploring how those psychological and cognitive elements interact, often creating a feedback loop where, failing at one reinforces failure at the other. There is clearly much more to explore within this material.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on the debate.